Hello, my dudes. Welcome to the stream. I'm with Rels.
Hello?
I'm gonna say Mr. Beast 1,000 times.
Can I appreciate there's only two people on the live stream while we have a fan base of 200.
Yeah, but
Whoa.
everyone in Discord is just spamming cry emojis, so that's not my
What?
problem. I'm sorry about that. But before I say it, I'm gonna drink some H2O. Ah, so here we go. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Wait, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast? Where's. Okay. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Only the two this goes.
Empty beast, wow.
It only goes to two.
Okay, let me explain the Epic Gamer stuff. So,
Let me try again.
GB, aka Gamer
Wait,
Butters,
Mr.
will
Beast.
be doing Mr. Beast 1000
Yes.
times thing while I'll be answering the questions because he'll be doing the thing.
Yes, I'm gonna try to
Basically,
find a.
rules no swear words, only gay, no question, but yes. Um, No spam.
Counter.
No spam. I almost forgot
I'm gonna
that.
search for counters. Was the other one didn't go
Okay. Okay. So
online count online clicker counter? No. We're trying to find a counter. Why there's no counter? It is actually good. No. Raz, do you know a clicker counter? Or a
clicker
spacebar?
counter.
Because that one didn't count. It only goes up to 2. Like, why is it a clicker counter if it doesn't go more up than 2? I did stop. It's okay, it's okay, it's okay.
Oh,
Scarlet,
I found a perfect one.
can you send me the link?
Yeah, I can send you. I
Sorry.
can send you.
It's okay, it's okay, it's okay, Scarlet.
This one can go underneath a 0.
Yeah, I know. Even that one, but it only goes to 2 or to -2, which I don't know why.
You need to think outside of the box to continue after.
Yes.
Legends speak it is impossible to
Yeah,
continue.
just send me the link.
If Discord wasn't lagging, I would send you already, but can't. I'm trying my best not to. That is just say trying my best to not to send it, but I'm trying to send it. I'm stupid.
Okay, can I make it bigger?
You can't, but that's it.
Okay, then. Second option. Just make the stream bigger. I think that's perfect. Okay. Here we all go. Wait. Okay, it doesn't work for the other single. So here we go. In 3, 2, 1, go. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Already at 10, guys. 9, oh more. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. B, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Okay, we're already at 40. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Please watch my content, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Give me a shout out as well, please. Mr. Beast. 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 Okay, I'm getting tired. Mr. Beast. 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 Okay, we're to 100.
Epic. Pretty quick.
900. 900 to go. Mr. Beast. 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 Don't worry, we don't mind Scarlet Knight. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast.
I suggest
Mr.
you do
Beast.
it like 10 more times at the
Mr.
end.
Beast. Yep. Mr.
So if
Beast.
you
Mr.
like in
Beast.
case
Mr.
with
Beast.
some, you
Mr.
can.
Beast. Yep, I'm gonna do that as well. So we're going 1-1-0. If I don't miss one by mistake. Mr.
Okay.
Beast. Mr. 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 Beast. By the way, Moonshine, it wasn't suggested by me. It was a challenge that the audience gave me. Mr. Beast. 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 Mr. Beats. Doing the beat. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beats. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beats. Mr. Beats. Mr. Beast. 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 Mr. Beats. Mr. Beast. 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 800 to go.
Nice.
Mr. Beast. 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 Yep. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Mr. Mr. Beast.
Yo,
Mr.
we're back.
Beats. Okay. Mr. Beats. Mr. Beast. 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 Is this really a challenge? Try it yourself! Mr. Beast. 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 Mr. Beast.
Be right back again.
Mr. Beast. Okay. Mr. Beast. 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 Mr. Beats. Mr. Beats. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beats. Mr. Beast. 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 Mr. Beats. Mr. Beats. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast.
You make me Pokoloko too.
300.
I'm back. How much you have?
300.
Nice. Pretty quickly.
I have to. This is a challenge. I know it's a sacrifice, but I will try. Moonshine, you gave me this challenge.
Scarlet, let me tell you something. the
Mr.
reason
Beast,
was it's
Mr. Beast,
taking not
Mr.
long
Beast,
is
Mr.
because
Beast, Mr.
the
Beast,
fastest
Mr.
time ever
Beast,
done is
Mr. Beast,
25 minutes.
Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast,
And it's
Mr.
really
Beast,
easy to
Mr.
beat.
Beast, Mr. 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 Beast. Moonshine, I know I will lose my voice, but this is a challenge. I never run away from a challenge, and you guys are worth it for it. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. I think I'm gonna have fanfiction in my dreams about Mr. Beast, saying it so much. Mr. Beast, Mr.
Mhm.
Beast, Mr. 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 Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beats, Mr. Beats, Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. I'm sorry for that, Moonshine, but still, I won't give up for the challenge. I have 2 bottles of H2O, high quality. That's one of my new catchphrase. 600 to go.
I'm like,
Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Yes, my dude. Don't worry, Moonshine. Don't you dare worry. I got it under control. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. And by the way, guys, give some Mr. Beast some support if you're not already. Subscribe to him. He's a pretty epic dude. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. It's Captain, is Capty Cool Man Hat YT High. Thank you for joining my dude, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast,
hey,
Mr.
people
Beast,
watching,
Mr.
dude.
B, Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Wait, you can't talk. Don't worry, my dude. Wait, is the chat good? Can they hear you? Oh, okay. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. And guys, if you have Twitter, go spam Mr. Beast Twitter to give him maybe some support for me. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast,
Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast,
Mr.
Mr.
Beast,
Beast,
Mr. Beast,
Mr.
Mr.
Beast,
Beast, Mr. Beast,
Mr.
Mr.
Beast.
Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Halfway there. And plus, if you have Twitter, follow me as well. I have the link in my channel. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. He's going through puberty. I think he will be fine. Yep, I am going in puberty. That's why I sound like that. aka Pugert, he made me like this. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Woo! Ah, Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. 555. I'm gonna take a little bit water break. I know it's real bad, but still, guys, you are all worth it for this. That's why I'm doing this. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr.
Wait,
Beast,
imagine the
Mr. Beast,
actual
Mr.
Mr.
Beast,
Beast
Mr.
sees you and
Beast.
he dominates.
I would freak out. Mr. Beast, 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 600, 600. Ah. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr.
Did you
Beast,
reach
Mr.
the
Beast, Mr. Beast.
haunted number? Did you reach the evil number?
Almost. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beats, Mr. Beast. We just need one more Mr. Beast to reach that even number. So we're gonna do this fast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Woo! Mr. Beast, 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 700. Ooh, 300 to more. Oh my god. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Ooh. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. G, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast,
Mr. Beast, Mr. Bean, what?
Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beats, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beats. Ah, 777. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, who's Mr. Beast? I say Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast,
It sounds like
Mr.
you're saying
Beast. Yeah, but
Mr. B
when
sometimes.
it's fast.
Just continue.
Yeah,
Just continue.
yeah, but when it's fast, I'm gonna sound a little different because there's like with
Just continue.
Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Water break. 200 to more. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Wait, Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Ah, no, I'm saying Mr. Beast, not Mr. Bean. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. If you want, we can do it next time. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. I wish you can watch this so you can be proud of me. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Hi,
No,
Mr. Beast,
no, my
Mr. Beast,
cheese
Mr.
fell.
Beast,
No.
Rip, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. I mean, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast,
I feel like
Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Keys. No, you're making things funny now. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast.
you want
100
me
to
to
go.
stop? You want me to stop him from doing that, like annoying you?
No, it's funny. It's funny.
Okay, okay.
It's just funny. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr.
Come on,
Beast,
Mr. Beast,
Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast,
We're
Mr.
still
Beast,
going.
Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast,
You're about to
Mr.
do
Beast,
it.
Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. 50 to go. Mr. Beast,
yeah.
Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Guys, if you have Twitter, go spam Mr. Beast about this challenge. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast,
Mr.
Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. 20 to go. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Just one more. Mr. Beast. I'm gonna do a few
Uh,
more just in case. Mr. Beast. 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 No, not Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. The last you said, okay. Mr. Beast. 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 BRB, guys. Be right back.
1,000, but nice. Reached 1,000. I finished my food.
Lord. Should I continue?
Surprising.
I'm gonna continue a little bit more just to be fair if I messed a little bit more up. Mr. Beast. 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 Let's reach one. All of them once. Mr. Beast. 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 No Mr. Strings. Mr. Beast. 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 Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. We're done.
Okay, I am back.
All one. Done. One. Done. We finally did it.
Congratulations.
I think he's fine. Yeah.
That was so heartwarming. Well, that's enough from you. You have to do the whole challenge one again.
If you want that, I will do it again. No joke.
Not 2,000 this time.
You're on.
No, I was joking. No, I was joking.
No, you're on. You're
no,
on.
I ruined his life.
You're on. I'm not gonna do it today. But guys,
you will do it in the next 2 years.
No, guys, because I'm like you know, I'm going on holiday soon. Oh, yes. And by the way, I said more than 1,000 words. You know why? Because it's Mr. Beast. So basically, I already done it. I done like 200, 2,000, 222. Because Mr. and Mr. Beast.
Kako moram da jedem, moram da jedem.
Yep, we already done it, my dude.
Može voda barem. So many people join just for you to say Mr. Beast. Wow. Be right back.
But guys, tell me in chat. It may sound crazy. Should we do it 2,000 now? Should we? All we need, and guys, let's show this to Mr. Beast. But guys, 1,000 was a challenge. But should we go do it? 2,000. Should we go for the 1,000? Should we? Should we go for 1,000? Like I said, we're already at 1,100. So shall we? Come on, guys. Come on. Not today? Okay. We do it next time. Okay.
Ahoy,
Okay.
nighttime book.
Okay, we're gonna do it next time. We're gonna say anything you want. Maybe we should do anything
This
you
time's
want
this time's
of
15
2000.
time.
But okay, guys, should we end stream this one so we can keep it saved and I start a Roblox stream? So if MrBeast sees this, not after he sees the Roblox gameplay. I think that's a smart idea. You think?
Imagine MrBeast comes on your live stream and he's like, "Nah, this guy records Fortnite. Fortnite, really bad game. No donation." He
Wait, BRB. Yes, okay. Guys, before we go, do you have any questions? Do you have anything you want to say before I go into a Roblox stream?
I have a question.
Like for yes, tell me, my dude.
Okay. Are you gay?
No.
It's just a
If you
joke.
didn't know, I forgot it was 2 weeks or 3 weeks ago. I had a massive breakup.
Oh,
No joke.
that's so heartwarming.
Yeah, I know.
But I don't really care. Not a joke. Not a joke. Not a
No,
joke.
that's actually true because it's not your life.
Oh yeah. MrBeast did a joke where
Okay, my
the Discord talent show.
yeah.
There was this guy that was super freestyle rapping about. Can I say the AS word?
No.
How can I say this?
Without bad language.
Pockety, and everybody asks him
Yeah,
to
okay,
do.
I saw that.
Yeah, you saw when MrBeast said that's so heartwarming.
I
Well,
sent
that's enough
on
from
one
me.
video for MrBeast. Guys, I'm gonna end stream. We're gonna start stream in a few seconds. So we'll be right back.
We go back in time.